Shayna Michelle Hubers. What happens when a relationship becomes an obsession so consuming that rejection feels like death itself? When does love cross the line into something darker, something dangerous? On October 12, 2012, a young woman in Highland Heights, Kentucky, made a phone call that would expose the answer to those questions in the most chilling way possible. She dialed 911 to report that she had just ended a life. Not a stranger's life, not an intruder's life, but the life of the man she claimed to adore more than anyone in the world. This is the story of Shayna Michelle Hubers. Shayna was born in Kentucky and grew up as an academically gifted student who seemed destined for success. By her early 20s, she had graduated cum laude from the University of Kentucky and was pursuing a master's degree in school counseling. She was bright, ambitious, and by all appearances had a promising future ahead of her. But beneath that polished exterior was a young woman struggling with something far more complex than her academic transcripts could reveal. In 2011, when Shayna was 20 years old, she received a friend request on Facebook from a man named Ryan Carter Poston. He was a 28-year-old attorney with a successful career, a charming smile, and a passion for chess. He had stumbled across her spring break photos and was immediately interested. For Shayna, this attention from an older, accomplished professional must have felt like validation. They began dating shortly after connecting online, and to outsiders they seemed like an enviable couple. He was handsome and successful, she was beautiful and intelligent. But the relationship that looked perfect on social media was anything but stable in reality. From the beginning, friends noticed warning signs. The relationship was volatile, marked by constant breakups and reconciliations. Ryan's friends later testified that he tried to end things with Shayna multiple times, but she would show up at his condominium unannounced, refusing to leave. She sent him dozens of text messages every single day, sometimes as many as 50 to 100 messages in a 24-hour period. For every one message Ryan sent, Shayna would respond with a flood of texts. At one point, Ryan confided in his cousin that Shayna's behavior was escalating to restraining order level territory. She appeared at his home repeatedly. She asked people whether they thought she was prettier than his ex-girlfriend. The obsession was becoming impossible to ignore. But Shayna saw things differently. According to her later statements, Ryan was controlling and emotionally manipulative. She claimed he made cruel comments about her weight and appearance. She said he treated her like a toy, pushing her away only to pull her back when it suited him. Whether these allegations had merit or not, one thing was clear. The relationship had become toxic for both of them. And by October of 2012, Ryan was ready to move on for good. Ryan had recently connected on Facebook with Audrey Bolte, the reigning Miss Ohio USA. They had been chatting and texting for months, and Ryan finally asked her out. They made plans to meet for drinks on the evening of October 12th at a bar in Milford, Ohio. Ryan was excited about the date and hopeful about starting fresh with someone new, but he was also nervous. The day before the planned date, he confided in his stepfather, Peter Carter, that he was afraid to tell Shayna about it. He knew how she might react. He had no idea just how right his fear would prove to be. On the evening of October 12th, as Ryan prepared to leave for his date with Audrey, Shayna showed up at Ryan's Highland Heights condominium. What happened next would end Ryan's life and alter the course of Shayna's forever. According to the prosecution, the two got into an argument. Shayna was furious that Ryan was going out with someone else. Ryan, fed up with the drama, likely told her in no uncertain terms that their relationship was over. At some point during that confrontation, Shayna picked up Ryan's own handgun, a weapon he was licensed to carry, and she fired. Not once, not twice, but 6 times. Ryan was hit on multiple sides of his body. He collapsed to the floor of his living room, and as he lay there, Shayna fired a final round while he was already down. After the shooting, Shayna waited 10 to 15 minutes before calling 911. When she finally made the call, she claimed self-defense. She told the operator that Ryan had been throwing her around the room, that he had been physically aggressive, and that she had no choice but to protect herself. But when police arrived at the scene, they found something that didn't match her story. The living room was orderly. There were no signs of a struggle.
Shayna had no visible injuries on her body to suggest she had been assaulted, and Ryan had been shot 6 times, including once while he was already on the ground. Detectives brought Shayna to the police station for questioning. After being read her Miranda rights, she initially asked for an attorney, but then, inexplicably, she kept talking. What she said during that interrogation would become some of the most damning evidence against her. She made jokes about Ryan's appearance, telling officers that he had always wanted a nose job and that by shooting him in the face, she had given him exactly what he wanted. She seemed oddly detached from the gravity of what had just happened. At one point, she wondered aloud whether anyone would ever want to marry her if they knew she had taken a life in self-defense. When police left her alone in the interrogation room, cameras captured her singing Amazing Grace, dancing, and saying repeatedly, "I did it. I can't believe I did that. I'm so good at acting." Shayna was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and held on a $3 million bond. Her trial began in April of 2015. Prosecutors painted her as a jealous, obsessed woman who couldn't handle rejection. They presented text message evidence showing her fixation on Ryan. They called witnesses who testified that Shayna had previously talked about harming Ryan. One friend recalled Shayna saying she wanted to take Ryan to a shooting range, turn around, and make his passing look like an accident. The evidence was overwhelming. After only 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty. The judge sentenced her to 40 years in prison, calling it one of the most cold-blooded acts he had encountered in over 30 years in the criminal justice system. But Shayna's story didn't end there. In 2016, her conviction was overturned when it was discovered that one of the jurors had failed to disclose a felony conviction. A second trial was ordered. In August of 2018, a new jury heard the case again. The defense argued that Shayna suffered from borderline personality disorder and acted under extreme emotional disturbance. But once again, the jury saw through the claims. They convicted her of the same charge in the same amount of time, 5 hours. This time, the sentence was even harsher: life in prison with eligibility for parole after 20 years. Today, Shayna Hubers is incarcerated in Kentucky. Her earliest chance for freedom will come in 2032. For Ryan Poston's family, no sentence could ever bring him back. His father spoke at her sentencing about the unbearable weight of losing a son, of knowing he would never hold grandchildren, of facing decades of holidays without Ryan. Shayna's case serves as a reminder that obsession, when left unchecked, can turn affection into possession and rejection into rage. Ryan Poston simply wanted to move on with his life, but the woman who couldn't let him go made sure that he never would.
Chelsea Perkins. How far would you go if the justice system failed you? If someone hurt you in a way that scarred your soul, and the authorities said there wasn't enough proof to hold them accountable? Would you accept that answer and move on with your life? Or would you spend years planning, waiting, and eventually driving across state lines with a loaded weapon to make sure they never hurt anyone again? For Chelsea Perkins, the answer to that question led to a national park, a single gunshot, and a prison sentence that will consume decades of her life. But the story didn't end with her conviction. It spiraled into something darker, involving grief-stricken parents, mistaken identity, and another life taken in the aftermath of rage. Chelsea Denise Perkins grew up in Virginia and appeared to have a future many would admire. She joined the United States Coast Guard and served her country with distinction. By her early 30s, she had married a fellow service member and seemed to be building a stable life. But after leaving active duty, Chelsea's path took an unexpected turn. She entered the adult entertainment industry and began creating content on OnlyFans under the name Sabrina Savage. To her followers, she was confident, bold, and successful. But beneath that public persona was a woman carrying the weight of something that had happened years earlier, something she claimed the justice system had refused to address. In 2017, Chelsea went to the police in Virginia Beach with a serious allegation. She told authorities that a man named Matthew Dunmeyer, someone she had known in high school, had assaulted her years earlier. She wanted justice, she wanted accountability, but investigators told her there wasn't enough evidence to move forward with charges. The case was closed before it ever reached a courtroom. For Chelsea, that decision was more than a disappointment. It was a wound that would fester for years, transforming frustration into something far more dangerous. Matthew Dunmeyer, meanwhile, had moved on with his life. He was 31 years old in 2021 and living in Ohio. He worked at a screen printing shop, played music, and had 2 young children. His friends described him as someone who radiated positivity. He was the kind of person who could make your day better just by being around. In early March of 2021, he told coworkers that he was meeting up with a woman who was visiting the Cleveland area. He seemed excited about the encounter. What he didn't know was that the woman coming to see him had been thinking about this meeting for a very long time, and she wasn't coming for a reunion. On March 5, 2021, Chelsea drove her husband's small white smart car from Virginia to Ohio. The journey took her across multiple states, and she left a digital trail that would later become critical evidence against her. When she arrived in the Cleveland area, she picked up Matthew and took him to an Airbnb rental property. The 2 spent the night together. To anyone watching, it might have looked like 2 old acquaintances reconnecting after years apart. But Chelsea had something else in mind. The next morning, March 6th, Chelsea drove Matthew to Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Valley View, Ohio. They parked near a cemetery and began hiking together. They walked past the gravestones, crossed deep ravines, and eventually ventured off the main trail into a heavily wooded area where few people would wander. Chelsea was carrying a loaded 9mm handgun. As they walked deeper into the isolated wilderness, she pulled out the weapon and fired a single round into the back of Matthew's head. He collapsed to the ground. She left him there among the trees and walked away. After the act, Chelsea didn't rush home. Instead, she drove to Michigan and walked into a tattoo parlor called Family Ink. That same day, she got a tattoo of a noose inked under her forearm. The symbolism was unmistakable. Then she began her journey back to Virginia, leaving behind a man who would not be found for 3 more days. Hikers discovered Matthew's body on March 9th. The location was on federal land, which meant the FBI took over the investigation. Agents began piecing together the final hours of his life. They learned from his coworkers that he had been picked up by a dark-haired woman in a small white car. Surveillance footage and turnpike records showed Chelsea's vehicle making the cross-country trip. DNA evidence on a water bottle at the scene matched Chelsea's profile. When agents executed a search warrant at her Virginia home, they found 3 9mm pistols. One was in a purse that also contained her identification. Ballistics testing confirmed that weapon had been used in the shooting. Investigators also uncovered something deeply disturbing on Chelsea's cell phone. She had written a note and then deleted it. The note was designed to look like a farewell message from Matthew, as if he had taken his own life. It was a calculated attempt to mislead investigators and frame the incident as something other than what it was. Chelsea was arrested in December of 2021 at her home in Pensacola, Florida. She was charged with second-degree homicide and using a firearm during a crime of violence on federal property. In May of 2025, she pleaded guilty to both charges. During her sentencing hearing in September of 2025, she addressed the court and said she took full responsibility for what she had done. Federal Judge Solomon Oliver acknowledged the complexity of the case. He agreed with prosecutors that her motive was revenge, but he also considered testimony about the trauma she had experienced throughout her life. He sentenced her to 22.5 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. But the tragedy didn't stop there. In November of 2021, while Chelsea was still on the run, Matthew's mother, Tommy Lynn Dunmeyer, and his stepfather, John Nelson McQuillan, decided to take matters into their own hands. They drove to Washington, D.C., where they believed Chelsea was hiding. Tommy Lynn disguised herself as a delivery driver and knocked on the door of an apartment. When a woman answered, Tommy Lynn fired 2 rounds into her abdomen. But it wasn't Chelsea. It was an innocent woman who had nothing to do with the case. She survived, but the attack left her physically and emotionally scarred. As police closed in on the fleeing couple, Tommy Lynn turned the gun on herself. Her stepfather was later convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Today, Chelsea Perkins is serving her sentence at a federal facility in West Virginia. Matthew Dunmeyer's children are being raised by family members in Virginia, growing up without the father who friends say always seemed so happy.
The case of Chelsea Perkins forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, trauma, and the line between victim and perpetrator. If her allegations were true, then she was failed by a system that should have protected her. But taking a life in the name of revenge didn't bring healing. It only created more pain, more grief, and more lives forever altered by violence. In the end, 2 families were shattered, and a cycle of hurt that should have ended with accountability in a courtroom instead ended with bodies and broken hearts scattered across multiple states.
Kelsey Nicole Turner. When beauty becomes currency and generosity transforms into obsession, where does the transaction end? Can affection purchased with rent money and luxury cars ever feel like real love? And when the checks stop coming, when the benefactor decides the price has grown too high, does dependency turn into desperation? Into rage? In March of 2019, a 71-year-old California psychiatrist made the last trip of his life. He flew to Las Vegas, not for recreation or business, but to confront a woman about lies that had finally become too much to ignore. Days later, hikers near Lake Mead would discover his abandoned blue Mercedes-Benz, and inside its trunk, they would find him. This is the story of Kelsey Nicole Turner and the man who paid for everything until there was nothing left to give. Thomas Kirk Burchard wasn't just a doctor. He was a highly regarded child psychiatrist from Salinas, California, who had dedicated his career to helping young people navigate their most difficult moments. He was 71 years old, but still working, still seeing patients, still making a difference in his community. He had been in a committed relationship with Judy Earp for 17 years. They had built a life together, one rooted in stability and mutual respect. But Burchard had a vulnerability that would prove fatal. He was lonely in ways his relationship couldn't seem to fix, and when he met Kelsey Turner online, that loneliness found an outlet. Kelsey Turner was in her mid-20s when she connected with Burchard. She had modeled for Playboy Italia and Maxim, building an Instagram following under the name Bad Barbie. She presented herself as glamorous, impulsive, and living life to the fullest. In an interview with Playboy, she described herself as someone who loved emotions and fun, who lived fully aware that she only had one life. To Burchard, who had spent decades focused on helping others, Kelsey must have seemed like a breath of fresh air, exciting, dangerous, intoxicating. He became obsessed with her, and she became financially dependent on him. It was a relationship built on a transaction that neither of them wanted to name. Burchard began paying Kelsey's rent, first in Salinas, where she lived with her mother, then in Las Vegas, where she moved with her boyfriend, John Logan Kennison, and their roommate, Deanna Pena. He covered the lease on their home. He made the payments on the blue Mercedes-Benz she drove. He sent money whenever she asked. According to Judy Earp, Kelsey presented herself as someone struggling, someone on the verge of homelessness, someone who needed help. Burchard, generous to a fault, stepped in to save her. But as the months went by, he began to realize that Kelsey wasn't just financially struggling, she was lying about everything. By early 2019, Burchard had decided to cut her off. He had given her hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it was never enough. She always needed more: the rent, the car, her bills, her lifestyle. When he tried to establish boundaries, she found ways to manipulate him back into giving. Judy Earp later testified that Kelsey had even forged checks using Burchard's name and account number, printing them on her home computer and using them to pay her expenses. The betrayal went deeper than financial theft. It was a complete exploitation of his kindness. On March 1, 2019, Burchard flew to Las Vegas without telling Kelsey he was coming. He wanted to see the situation for himself. When he called Judy Earp later that day, his words were clear. "Kelsey Turner is such a liar. I just had to check things out for myself." Whatever he saw during that visit convinced him that the relationship was over, but he didn't leave Las Vegas immediately, and that decision would cost him his life. The next day, March 2nd, Kelsey and her boyfriend, John Kennison, were driving Burchard around Las Vegas in the very car he had paid for. At some point during the drive, Kelsey went through Burchard's phone. Deanna Pena, who was in the car with them, later testified that Kelsey saw messages between Burchard and her own mother that upset her. The argument escalated when they returned to the house they all shared. According to Pena, the confrontation turned physical. Kennison raised a baseball bat in Burchard's direction.
The elderly psychiatrist was injured, bleeding, with a visible bruise on his head. Peña testified that Burchard begged them to take him to a hospital. He was still alive, still conscious, still hoping for mercy. But instead of calling for help, Kelsey allegedly told Kennison to knock Thomas out. Peña recalled Burchard looking at her and saying something that would haunt her forever. "You know they're going to end my life." And then, while Peña watched in terror, Kennison continued the assault. By the time it was over, Thomas Burchard was gone. The aftermath was a scene of panic and cover-up. Peña testified that Kennison asked Peña to clean the house while the assault was still happening. She described finding blood throughout the garage and inside the home. Cleaning supplies were everywhere. The door to one room had been broken in half during the struggle. Eventually, Kennison and Kelsey loaded Burchard's body into the trunk of the blue Mercedes-Benz and left it abandoned with his body inside and a baseball bat covered in evidence. Then they fled to California, taking Peña with them. But Peña couldn't live with what she had witnessed. After escaping from Kelsey and Kennison, she turned herself in to police and provided testimony that would become the foundation of the case against them. She pled guilty to accessory to a crime in exchange for her cooperation. Her charge was reduced because prosecutors recognized that she had been terrified, coerced, and ultimately brave enough to come forward. Kelsey was arrested outside a home in Northern California with her 4-year-old daughter. John Kennison was arrested separately in Las Vegas. At trial, prosecutors presented a damning case. The house where Burchard had been attacked was filled with physical evidence: blood, footprints, cleaning supplies, towels that matched the one found with Burchard's body. Kennison's fingerprints were found inside the car along with Peña's. The timeline, the witnesses, and the forensic evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. In July of 2020, John Kennison pled guilty to second-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit the same. He was sentenced to 18 to 45 years in prison. In November of that same year, Kelsey entered an Alford plea, which allowed her to accept that the state had enough evidence to convict her without admitting guilt. In January of 2023, she was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison. During the hearing, Judy Earp delivered a victim impact statement that captured the magnitude of the loss. "My entire world was viciously ripped from me with the taking of Thomas Burchard." She told the court that she feared for her safety, that Kelsey had threatened her life before, and that she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Today, Kelsey Nicole Turner is incarcerated in Nevada. She will be eligible for parole in 2033. Thomas Burchard's patients were left without the psychiatrist who had helped so many of them. His partner was left without the man she had spent 17 years building a life with. And his story stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of relationships built on financial dependency, manipulation, and the illusion of affection. Burchard wanted to help someone he thought was in need. Instead, he found someone willing to take everything he had, including his life.
Taylor Schabusiness. There are betrayals of trust that steal money. There are lies that ruin reputations. But what about the kind of deception that ends with someone finding their child's remains in a bucket? In February of 2022, a mother in Green Bay, Wisconsin, walked down to her basement to check on her 24-year-old son. What she discovered there would become one of the most disturbing cases in Wisconsin criminal history. The person responsible wasn't a stranger who had broken in during the night. It was someone her son had trusted, someone he had invited into their home, someone who claimed to care for him. This is the story of Taylor Schabusiness. Taylor Schabusiness was 25 years old when her name became associated with a case that shocked investigators across Wisconsin. She had grown up dealing with personal struggles and family difficulties. Her father later testified that her mother had passed away in her sleep, and the loss had deeply affected their family. By her 20s, Taylor was navigating a complicated relationship with substances and had previous encounters with law enforcement. In 2020, she was arrested for driving 80 miles per hour through the city of Green Bay. Despite treatment programs and monitoring requirements following that incident, the interventions did not create lasting change. She cut off her monitoring bracelet and continued down a path that would lead to something far more serious. Taylor had a relationship with a young man named Shad Thyron. He was 24 years old and lived with his mother, Tara Pekanich, and her boyfriend in Green Bay.
Shad and Taylor had an intimate relationship that involved both emotional and physical connection. On the surface, they appeared to be a couple navigating the ups and downs of young adulthood, but beneath that surface, there were patterns developing that no one could have predicted would lead to such a dark outcome. On the evening of February 21, 2022, Taylor picked up Shad from his mother's house. The two of them, along with a friend, went to an apartment where they spent time together. After the friend left, Taylor and Shad used substances together. They then returned to Shad's mother's house, where she and her boyfriend were away at the time. The couple went down to the basement, and what happened next would change multiple lives forever. According to what Taylor later told investigators, she and Shad had previously engaged in certain intimate activities that involved restraint. On this particular night, they used metal chains during their encounter. At some point during this time together, Taylor began to strangle Shad. She told detectives she could feel his heart beating as she was choking him, so she kept pulling and choking harder. The strangulation continued for several minutes until Shad was no longer alive. What followed in the hours after his passing was behavior that even experienced law enforcement professionals struggled to comprehend. Taylor engaged in intimate acts with his body for several hours. Then, in the early morning, she proceeded to dismantle his remains using knives she found in the house. She worked methodically, positioning the body to contain fluids and disposing of what she could down the basement drain. She placed different parts into various containers, including plastic bags, cardboard boxes, and a bucket. In the early hours of February 23rd, Tara Pakanich returned home and heard the door shut. She went downstairs to check whether her son was still there or if he had left with Taylor. What she found in the basement was her son's head in a bucket, covered with a towel. The trauma of that discovery is something no parent should ever have to endure. Tara's boyfriend called the police, who searched the basement and found human remains in multiple locations.
When police brought Taylor in for questioning, officers noticed she had injuries on her hands, including a cut on her thumb and scratches. Her hands showed red staining. When they told her what they had found, she allegedly responded by saying, "That was pretty messed up." During the interrogation, she admitted to what had happened. She told them she had experienced something like a blackout after using substances. When describing the strangulation, she said she just went crazy. In a chilling moment during questioning, when asked about her state of mind, she allegedly said in a lower tone that she liked it. Taylor was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, third-degree intimate assault, and mutilating remains. Her attorney initially entered a not guilty plea and later added a not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect plea. The legal process that followed was almost as dramatic as the case itself. In February of 2023, during a court hearing, Taylor attacked her attorney after he requested a trial delay so experts could assess her mental competency. A sheriff's officer had to tackle her in the courtroom. No one was seriously hurt, but her attorney later requested to be removed from the case. A new attorney took over and asked the judge to step aside since he had witnessed the attack, but the judge declined. During the trial, mental health experts testified about Taylor's psychological state. One forensic psychologist shared that during an evaluation, Taylor had mentioned having a thing with infamous criminal Jeffrey Dahmer, even though Dahmer had been deceased since 1994. The psychologist also testified that Taylor had thrown a plastic chair at her during one evaluation session. In July of 2023, a jury convicted Taylor of all 3 charges. In a second phase, the jury also determined that she was not mentally ill at the time of the offense, which meant she would face prison rather than a mental health facility. In September of 2023, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional consecutive sentences totaling 18 years for the other charges. Today, Taylor Shabiznes is serving her sentence at the Taycheedah Correctional Institution, a facility for women in Fond du Lac. Even behind bars, her story has continued. She has been charged with additional incidents involving attacks on staff and has appeared in court multiple times since her conviction. The case of Taylor Shabiznes raises questions that many people find difficult to answer. What leads someone to such actions? How does a relationship transform into something so devastating?
For Tara Pekanich, the answers to those questions will never bring her son back. The image of what she found in her basement that February morning is something no amount of justice can erase. For the community of Green Bay, the case served as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person is not the stranger in the shadows, but someone who walks through the front door. The tragedy of Shad Thyrion's final hours is that he welcomed into his home the very person who would take his life and desecrate his memory in ways that continue to haunt everyone who learned the details of this case.
Nikki Ensel. What happens when surveillance cameras record every step of your plan, yet you still believe you can outsmart everyone? When love transforms into conspiracy and insurance policies become blueprints for destruction? In early January of 2020, firefighters rushed to a burning home outside Bismarck, North Dakota, responding to a frantic 911 call from a woman who feared her husband was trapped inside. They found him, but not the way anyone expected. The flames hadn't taken his life. Someone else had, days before the fire ever started. And the woman who made that emergency call knew far more than she was willing to admit. This is the story of Nikki Ensel. Nikki Sue Ensel was a 41-year-old mother of two living in Bismarck, North Dakota. She'd been married to Chad Ensel for years, and on the surface, their life appeared ordinary. Chad was 42 years old and worked steadily. He was known to friends and family as a devoted father who spent time with his children and participated in activities like bowling. His sister later described him as someone who brought light into any room he entered, someone whose kindness touched everyone who knew him. But marriages can hide complications that outsiders never see. And by late 2019, the Ensel household was harboring secrets that would soon explode into a criminal investigation. In the months leading up to Chad's passing, Nikki had become involved with a man named Earl Howard. He was a 43-year-old married man with dual Canadian and American citizenship who lived in Ontario. The relationship between Nikki and Earl developed quickly, and investigators later discovered that they had been meeting frequently in Bismarck. Surveillance cameras captured them together throughout the city. One particularly damning piece of footage showed the pair kissing in public outside a Walmart just days before Chad was found. When questioned about this later, Nikki would deny any romantic involvement, claiming that Earl was not her type, and suggesting that any kiss might have been a friendly gesture on the cheek, like she would give her children. But the evidence painted a very different picture of a couple deeply entangled in both passion and planning. On December 31, 2019, something happened inside the Ensel home that would set off a chain of events no one could reverse. Chad was at a bowling game that evening, enjoying time with friends in what would be his final night alive. Security cameras installed at the Ensel residence captured Nikki and Earl making multiple trips in and out of the house during the hours Chad was away. They appeared to be moving with purpose, entering and leaving repeatedly. Then, around the time investigators later believed Chad returned home and was confronted, the security camera was turned off using Nikki's login credentials. The screen went dark just as the most critical moments were about to unfold. Chad was shot twice with a shotgun inside his own bedroom. Forensic experts who examined the scene later testified that either wound would have been fatal. The gun was found on the bed, positioned in a way that did not align with what would be expected if someone had harmed themselves. After Chad's body fell to the floor, someone attempted to stage the scene to look like a tragic accident. A propane-fueled space heater was positioned near the bed, apparently in the hope that it would ignite and destroy physical evidence, but the house did not catch fire as planned. Days passed with Chad's body still inside the home and no flames consumed the bedroom. On January 2, 2020, Nikki called 911 to report a house fire. She told dispatchers that she had arrived home to find the residence filled with smoke and feared her husband was trapped inside. Firefighters responded immediately and discovered Chad's body in the bedroom. But investigators quickly noticed something was wrong. Chad had not perished from smoke or flames. He had been shot. And the fire Nikki reported turned out to be two separate fires set in different parts of the house. One was in the bedroom where Chad's body lay. The other was in the basement, positioned on top of the furnace. Accidental fires do not typically start in two unconnected locations within the same structure.
Arson investigators brought in a specially trained canine to search for accelerants, and the dog detected traces of fire-starting substances. The investigation shifted immediately from a house fire to a homicide case with arson as a cover-up. Within a week of Chad's passing, detectives brought Nikki in for questioning. The interrogation lasted 6 hours, and during that time, Nikki's story changed repeatedly. At first, she claimed she had been at a hotel and knew nothing about what happened. Then she said she had been at the house and heard gunshots. Later, she claimed that Earl Howard had struggled with Chad over the gun and that the weapon had discharged during the fight while she waited outside in the car. Investigators noted that none of her accounts remained consistent. When asked about discrepancies, she would shift details, adjust timelines, and offer new explanations. Prosecutors later described her approach as telling detectives whatever she thought she could get away with at that moment. The evidence against Nikki mounted quickly. Just 4 days before Chad's passing, she had taken out a renter's insurance policy worth $26,000. She emailed a copy of that policy to Earl Howard, raising the question of why someone uninvolved in any plan would need access to those documents. Additionally, Nikki was the sole beneficiary of Chad's $600,000 life insurance policy. Within days of his passing, she was already making inquiries about how to collect on that policy. Prosecutors theorized that Nikki and Earl had conspired to end Chad's life and burn the house to destroy evidence, then use the insurance payouts to start a new life together in Texas. Earl Howard was arrested and charged alongside Nikki. In October of 2021, he accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit murder, and conspiracy to tamper with physical evidence. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the direct murder charge because forensic experts could not conclusively determine who had pulled the trigger. Howard was sentenced to 50 years in prison with 25 years suspended, meaning he would serve at least 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. He was scheduled to testify against Nikki at her trial, but prosecutors ultimately chose to not call him to the stand. Nikki's trial began in October of 2022. The prosecution presented security camera footage showing her and Earl entering and leaving the Ensel home multiple times on the night of Chad's passing. They presented the insurance documents, the inconsistencies in her statements, and the testimony of investigators who described the staged crime scene. Nikki's defense attorney called no witnesses. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 conspiracy charges. In February of 2023, Justice Douglas Barr sentenced Nikki Ensel to life in prison with the possibility of parole. She must serve at least 85% of her sentence, which amounts to 36 years and 105 days, before she can seek release. Today, Nikki Ensel is incarcerated in North Dakota. She appealed her conviction, arguing that prosecutors had failed to prove any agreement between her and Earl. In October of 2023, the North Dakota Supreme Court rejected her appeal. Chad Ensel's family continues to grieve the loss of a man they describe as loving, generous, and full of life. His sister spoke at Nikki's sentencing and said that while Nikki had stolen something precious from their family, they were reclaiming their power by choosing to remember Chad for who he truly was, rather than letting Nikki's actions define his memory. The case of Nikki Ensel is a story of surveillance cameras that captured a conspiracy in real time, of lies that collapsed under the weight of evidence, and of a family left to piece together why someone they trusted could orchestrate such an act. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person is not a stranger breaking in, but someone who already holds the keys.
Jodi Arias. Can obsession disguise itself so completely as devotion that even the person consumed by it believes they're acting out of love? When does the line between passion and possession vanish entirely? In September of 2006, a 26-year-old woman walked into a business convention in Las Vegas and met a man whose smile would change the trajectory of both their lives. For him, it would mean friendship, romance, and eventually a decision to move on. For her, it would mean a descent into fixation so complete that she would travel 1,000 miles through the desert night with weapons in her car, claiming later she had no memory of where she was going or why. This is the story of Jodi Ann Arias. Jodi Arias was born on July 9, 1980 in Salinas, California. She grew up in a household that she later described as troubled, marked by tension and instability. By her late teens, she had dropped out of high school, though she eventually earned her GED. She worked various jobs, including as a waitress and photographer, moving from place to place without establishing deep roots. Friends from that period described her as charming and artistic, someone who could adapt easily to new environments. But there were also whispers of intensity, of relationships that became too consuming, of a need for validation that seemed impossible to satisfy. In September of 2006, Jodi attended a conference in Las Vegas for Prepaid Legal Services, a company that offered legal insurance plans. There, she met Travis Victor Alexander, a 30-year-old motivational speaker and salesman who worked for the same organization. Travis was everything Jodi seemed drawn to. He was charismatic, successful, and deeply committed to his Mormon faith. He had overcome a difficult childhood, growing up in a home plagued by substance issues, and had transformed himself into a respected figure within his community. His friends described him as someone who radiated positivity, who made everyone around him feel valued and heard. Travis and Jodi connected immediately. Within days, they had become romantically involved. Jodi was so captivated by Travis and his lifestyle that she converted to Mormonism in November of that year, just 2 months after meeting him. She moved from California to Mesa, Arizona to be closer to him. For Travis's friends, the speed of Jodi's commitment was concerning. She seemed to mold herself into whatever Travis needed, adopting his faith, his interests, his circle. The relationship was intense from the start, marked by passionate highs and explosive conflicts. By summer of 2007, Travis ended the romantic relationship. He told friends that Jodi's behavior had become overwhelming. She showed up uninvited at his home. She accessed his email and social media accounts without permission. On at least one occasion, she slashed the tires on his car. Despite ending the official relationship, Travis continued to maintain contact with Jodi, and their interactions remained complicated. He confided in friends that he felt trapped, that Jodi wouldn't leave him alone, but he also struggled to cut ties completely. In April of 2008, Jodi moved back to California to live with her grandparents in Wairika. The distance should have provided closure, but for Jodi, the separation only intensified her fixation. In May, Travis sent her a series of text messages expressing his frustration. In one particularly direct message, he wrote that he wanted her to understand how harmful he believed her behavior had been. By late May, Travis had made plans to travel to Cancun, Mexico in June with another woman named Mimi Hall. For Jodi, the knowledge that Travis was moving forward without her may have been unbearable. On June 2, 2008, a gun was reported stolen from Jodi's grandparents' home in Eureka. 2 days later, on June 4th, Jodi drove from Northern California to Mesa, Arizona, a trip of more than 1,000 miles. She would later claim she had gotten lost, that she had intended to visit another friend, that the entire journey was a confused blur. But cell phone records, gas station receipts, and rental car records told a different story. She had rented a car, intentionally choosing one in a color that would blend in. She had turned her phone off during certain stretches of the drive, only turning it back on when she was hundreds of miles away from Mesa. On the evening of June 4th, Travis Alexander was at home alone. According to time-stamped photographs recovered from a digital camera found in his washing machine, Travis and Jodi spent time together that afternoon. The photos showed intimate moments, followed by images of Travis in the shower. Then the photos became chaotic, accidental snapshots captured during a struggle, a ceiling, a floor, and finally images that suggested something terrible had occurred. Travis was attacked in his bathroom. He suffered 27 stab wounds across his body. His throat was cut. He was shot in the head. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. When his body was discovered 5 days later by friends who had become concerned when he missed a work call, investigators found evidence that someone had attempted to clean up. The camera had been placed in the washing machine along with clothing, but a bloody palm print was found in the hallway. DNA testing revealed it belonged to both Travis and Jodi. Jodi was arrested on July 15, 2008 at her grandparents' home. Initially, she denied being in Arizona,
Then she claimed that two intruders had broken into Travis's home and attacked him while she watched helplessly. Finally, she admitted she had taken his life, but claimed it was in self-defense, that Travis had become aggressive and she had no choice but to protect herself. The trial began in January of 2013 and became a media spectacle. Jody took the stand and testified for 18 days, the longest defendant testimony in Arizona history. She described Travis as controlling and abusive. She claimed he had attacked her and she had acted to save her own life. But prosecutors presented a different narrative. They showed the jury the time-stamped photos. They introduced text messages showing Jody's obsession. They argued that she had driven to Mesa in a rage fueled by jealousy and rejection, armed with a gun and a knife, determined to make sure that if she couldn't have Travis, no one else would either. The jury deliberated for 15 hours before returning a guilty verdict on May 8, 2013. Jody Arias was convicted of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, jurors were tasked with deciding whether she should receive the death penalty or life in prison. They deadlocked. A second jury was impaneled in 2014, but they also failed to reach a unanimous decision. In April of 2015, a judge sentenced Jody to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Jody Arias is incarcerated in Arizona. She continues to maintain that she acted in self-defense. She sells artwork online and has suggested she is raising funds for future legal challenges. For Travis Alexander's family, no sentence could ever restore what they lost. His siblings have spoken about the unbearable pain of losing a brother they describe as loving, generous, and full of potential. The case of Jody Arias forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of human attachment. When does love become possession? When does rejection justify rage? And how do we reconcile the person Jody presented to the world, charming and devoted, with the person who drove through the night with weapons in her car? The answer, perhaps, is that obsession doesn't announce itself. It wears the mask of devotion until the moment it no longer needs to pretend.
Ashley Elizabeth White. What converts doubt into rage so instantly that within hours a single skeptical comment becomes a justification for ending a life? Can criticism about employment really transform into conspiracy on a bus ride home? In August of 2020, a woman in Commerce City, Colorado, returned from a job interview feeling uncertain about her future. Her boyfriend made a passing remark about her chances of success, the kind of comment that couples exchange every day without catastrophe. But this time was different. By the next morning, he would be gone, and the woman he had lived with would be under arrest for orchestrating his end with the help of a stranger she had met just hours earlier. This is the story of Ashley Elizabeth White. Ashley White was 25 years old in 2020, living with her boyfriend, Cody DeLisa, in a home on East 80th Avenue in the Derby neighborhood of Adams County. Cody, who went by his middle name, was 28 years old. Friends and family would later describe him as someone who had his whole life ahead of him. But according to investigators, the relationship between Ashley and Cody had become increasingly tense in the months before his passing. The primary source of friction was employment. Cody frequently criticized Ashley for her inability to secure full-time work, and those comments created a rift that grew wider with each passing week. Ashley expressed her frustration in private writings. In her diary, she wrote that she regretted ever meeting Cody. The resentment wasn't limited to words on a page. At some point during this period, Ashley attempted to harm Cody's cat. According to court documents, she tried to drown and burn the animal, an act that raised serious concerns about her emotional state and capacity for violence. The incident was a warning sign that something darker was building beneath the surface of their daily lives. On August 13, 2020, Ashley attended a job interview in Denver. She had arranged for a neighbor to drive her to the interview, but she returned home on public transportation. During the bus ride back to Commerce City, she texted Cody to tell him about the interview. His response was not encouraging. He expressed skepticism about her chances of getting the job. For Ashley, that comment was more than disappointing. It was the final straw. While still on the bus, Ashley struck up a conversation with a man who introduced himself as Scott. The two began talking, and Ashley shared details about her relationship with Cody. According to what Ashley later told investigators, she told Scott that Cody had assaulted her in the past. Scott's response was immediate and alarming. He told her they must end Cody's life. He said he had a gun, and together they could make it happen. Instead of rejecting the proposal or ending the conversation, Ashley agreed to the plan.
Before returning to the house she shared with Cody, Ashley and Scott got off the bus early. They found a secluded area where Scott could practice firing his weapon. They spent time preparing for what was about to happen, rehearsing the mechanics of what they intended to do. Then they walked together to Ashley's residence on East 80th Avenue. When they arrived, Ashley introduced Scott to Cody as her brother visiting from Texas. Cody had no reason to suspect that the man standing in his home was there to harm him. A short time later, Cody was shot twice in the head. Investigators never definitively established who pulled the trigger, but both Ashley and Scott were present when it happened. After Cody fell, Ashley and Scott took his wallet and left the residence together. They spent the next several days in the area before Scott eventually departed. Ashley told investigators that she never saw him again and had no way of contacting him. The identity of Scott remained a mystery for 3 years. On August 14, 2020, deputies from the Adams County Sheriff's Office responded to the home for a welfare check. What they found was Cody's body lying in a pool of blood. He had been shot in the head, and the scene suggested that he had been deceased for some time. Investigators quickly identified Ashley as a person of interest. She was missing from the residence, which raised immediate suspicion. When detectives located and interviewed her, Ashley provided a detailed account of what had happened. Her confession led to her arrest on charges of first-degree homicide and tampering with physical evidence. For 3 years, the case remained incomplete. Prosecutors had Ashley's confession, but they didn't know who Scott really was. Then in 2023, a woman contacted the district attorney's office with information that would crack the case wide open. She identified herself as the girlfriend of Michael Stratton and told authorities that Stratton had confessed to being involved in Cody DeLisa's ending. The details she provided matched Ashley's account almost perfectly. Michael Stratton was already in custody at the time. He had been arrested for a separate incident in Pueblo, Colorado, where he was accused of taking the life of a 39-year-old man named Michael Hunt just 19 days after Cody's passing. Stratton had been deemed incompetent to stand trial in the Pueblo case, and prosecutors in Adams County ultimately decided not to charge him in connection with Cody's case. The decision left Ashley as the sole defendant facing trial. Ashley's trial began on January 6, 2025, in Adams County District Court. It lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented evidence of the strained relationship between Ashley and Cody, including the diary entries and the incident involving the cat. They walked the jury through the timeline of August 13th, showing how Ashley had gone from a job interview to conspiracy within hours. They played recordings of her confession and presented testimony from investigators who had worked the case. Ashley's defense attorney, Jessica Jones, argued that her client was innocent and that the real responsibility lay with the man who had pulled the trigger. She criticized the district attorney's office for prosecuting Ashley while declining to charge Michael Stratton. On January 28, 2025, the jury returned its verdict. Ashley White was found guilty of second-degree homicide, conspiracy to commit second-degree homicide, and robbery. The conviction marked the end of a 4.5-year legal journey. Ashley's attorney immediately announced plans to continue fighting the conviction through appeals, insisting that the case was far from over. District Attorney Brian Mason released a statement describing the incident as a senseless act and emphasizing that Ashley bore significant responsibility for Cody's passing. Ashley White is scheduled to be sentenced on April 4, 2025. She faces decades in prison for her role in Cody DeLisa's ending. For Cody's family, no sentence will bring him back or erase the pain of losing someone they loved. The case of Ashley White forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how quickly frustration can turn into violence, how a single negative comment can spiral into conspiracy, and how a chance encounter with a stranger on public transportation can transform into the worst decision of someone's life. Cody DeLisa went to sleep on August 13th, believing his girlfriend was simply returning from a job interview. He had no idea that the woman he lived with had already decided, somewhere between Denver and Commerce City, that he would not see another sunrise. And that decision, made in anger over a skeptical text message, would cost him everything.
Brittany Holbrook. When someone pulls a trigger in the darkness of early morning, do they truly believe the lies they're about to tell will erase what they've done? Can claiming a memory gap make a bullet disappear from a loved one's back? In the small island community of Big Coppitt Key, Florida, where neighbors know each other and houses stand on stilts above the tropical landscape, a woman thought she could turn a shooting into self-defense with nothing more than words. But when the victim's final statement contradicted everything she claimed, and when her own body told a story different from the one her mouth was speaking, 12 jurors needed less than an hour to see through the performance. This is the story of Brittany Nicole Holbrook. Big Coppitt Key sits in the Florida Keys, a chain of islands stretching southwest from the mainland into the turquoise waters of the Atlantic. It's the kind of place where people move to escape the chaos of bigger cities, where life moves at a slower pace, and where the sound of the ocean becomes the backdrop to everyday routines. In June of 2023, Brittany Holbrook was 33 years old and living in a rented home at 491 Avenue F with her boyfriend, Tyler Newlish, and their roommate, Jordan Kinn. The house, like many in the Keys, was built on stilts to protect against flooding, with a patio underneath where the three roommates would gather after work to unwind. Tyler Newlish was 30 years old and had been born and raised in the Florida Keys. Friends described him as someone who lived life more fully in his 3 decades than most people manage in twice that time. He worked locally and had known many people in the tight-knit community for years. He and Brittany had been in a relationship for about 9 months, sharing the same bedroom in the stilted house, while Jordan occupied another room. To outsiders, they appeared to be a couple navigating the normal ups and downs of a relationship, but beneath the surface, tensions were building that would soon erupt in a way no one could have predicted. On the night of June 16, 2023, the 3 roommates followed their usual routine. After finishing work, they gathered on the patio beneath their home and drank together. The evening was unremarkable, the kind of night that happens countless times in households across the country. Eventually, all 3 went to their respective bedrooms to sleep. The house settled into quiet. And then, in the early morning hours of June 17th, that quiet was shattered by screaming. Jordan Kinn woke up to the sound of Brittany's voice piercing through the walls. He rushed out of his bedroom and into the living area where he found a scene that would haunt him forever. Tyler was lying on the floor, bleeding heavily. A 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun was visible nearby, along with a spent shell casing on the floor near a dog kennel. Brittany was beside Tyler, but her reaction to the crisis unfolding around her struck Jordan as strange. She seemed detached, almost disconnected from the gravity of what had just happened. Jordan immediately called 911. The dispatcher answered at 2:58 in the morning, and Jordan's voice carried the panic of someone who had just discovered his roommate in critical condition. He told the dispatcher that Tyler was in bad shape, that there was a lot of blood, and that help needed to come immediately. In the background of that call, screaming could be heard. The dispatcher asked where the blood was coming from, and Jordan had to turn to Brittany to get the answer. "Brittany, where is he bleeding from?" "His back." When Tyler was still conscious enough to speak, Jordan asked him what had happened. Tyler's response was direct and damning. "That woman shot me in the back," he said, referring to Brittany. According to Jordan's later testimony to detectives, Brittany had no reaction when Tyler made that statement. She didn't protest, she didn't defend herself. She simply remained silent as the man she had been in a relationship with for 9 months lay dying on the floor with a bullet wound in his lower back. Deputies from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office arrived within 5 minutes of the 911 call. Paramedics from Monroe County Fire Rescue followed immediately behind them. When they entered the living area, they found Tyler lying on the floor, bleeding from his lower back, with Brittany beside him. He was unconscious, but still breathing. Paramedics rushed him to Lower Keys Medical Center, but the injury was too severe. Tyler Newlish was pronounced gone an hour after arriving at the hospital. Detectives began interviewing Brittany while the scene was still being processed. Her initial statement was that she had no memory of what had happened. She told them there was a gap in her recollection. She remembered going to bed in the room she shared with Tyler. The next thing she remembered, she claimed, was being in the living room holding Tyler, who was covered in blood. She said she had been screaming, which woke up Jordan, who then called 911. But as detectives continued questioning her, Brittany's story evolved. She began claiming that Tyler had attacked her, that he had strangled her against a wall. She suggested that she had acted in self-defense, that the shooting had been a response to a physical assault. If her story had been true, investigators would have expected to find certain physical evidence: marks around her neck, bruising, petechiae, the small red dots that appear in the eyes when blood vessels burst during strangulation. But when deputies examined Brittany, they found nothing.
No marks of any kind were observed around her throat. No petechiae were observed in either of her eyes. Her body showed no signs consistent with the violent attack she was describing. The forensic evidence told a different story entirely. Tyler had been shot in the lower back. The wound placement suggested he had not been facing Brittany when the trigger was pulled. Additionally, Tyler's body showed bruising around his neck and scratches on his skin. If anyone had been strangled that night, the physical evidence suggested it was Tyler, not Brittany. Brittany was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty and spent the next year and a half preparing for trial. Her defense attorney argued that she had suffered from battered woman syndrome, claiming that her father, prior boyfriends, and Tyler himself had been physically aggressive toward her on at least 4 occasions. But prosecutors pointed out a glaring problem with that defense. Throughout the 9 months Brittany and Tyler had been together, she had never called the police. She had never filed any complaints of mistreatment against Tyler. There were no documented incidents, no restraining orders, no paper trail of the pattern her defense claimed existed. The trial began in February of 2025. Prosecutors presented the 911 recordings, Jordan's testimony about Tyler's final words, and the forensic evidence showing Brittany had no injuries consistent with strangulation. They showed the jury crime scene photographs and autopsy images revealing the bullet wound to Tyler's lower back. They introduced text messages from the final days of Tyler's life that, according to Brittany's own defense attorney, showed a loving relationship between the couple. The evidence, as the prosecutors would later say, spoke volumes. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on February 24, 2025. Brittany Holbrook was convicted of second-degree murder with a firearm. On April 11, 2025, Judge Mark Wilson sentenced her to 40 years in state prison. The first 25 years must be served without the possibility of earned gain time, meaning she cannot reduce her sentence through good behavior during that period. Today, Brittany Holbrook is incarcerated in Florida. Tyler Newlish's friends remember him as someone who had so much more life to live, so many more experiences ahead of him. The case serves as a reminder that in the moments after a tragedy, the truth often reveals itself through the simplest evidence. Tyler's final words, the absence of injuries on Brittany's body, the bullet in his back, and a jury that needed less than an hour to see past the claims of self-defense and recognize what had really happened in that living room on Big Coppitt Key.
Sarah Boone. Can something as ordinary as a suitcase become an instrument of ending? When does a game between partners transform into a final goodbye? On February 23, 2020, in a quiet apartment in Winter Park, Florida, a 42-year-old woman made a phone call to 911 that would expose one of the most disturbing cases in recent Florida history. She told the operator she had woken up to find her boyfriend unresponsive inside a piece of luggage. What she didn't mention was that she had recorded videos on her phone the night before, videos that captured him begging for his life while she laughed and reminded him of the pain he had caused her. This is the story of Sarah Boone. Sarah Boone was 42 years old in February of 2020, living in Winter Park with her boyfriend, Jorge Torres Jr. Jorge was also 42 and weighed just 103 pounds at the time of his passing. Friends and family knew the couple had a complicated relationship, one marked by volatility on both sides. Both Sarah and Jorge had been arrested for domestic incidents in the past. In July of 2018, Sarah was arrested for battery by strangulation against Jorge, though the charge was eventually dismissed. Jorge himself had multiple arrests for alleged instances of domestic violence against Sarah. Their relationship was a cycle of conflict, reconciliation, and more conflict. But nothing in their history prepared anyone for what would happen on that February night. On the evening of February 22, 2020, Sarah and Jorge spent the night drinking alcohol at their apartment. According to Sarah's later statements to investigators, the couple decided to play a game of hide-and-seek. At some point during the evening, they thought it would be amusing for Jorge to climb inside a large blue suitcase.
Sarah later told police that Jorge got into the suitcase voluntarily and that she zipped it shut as part of the game. What began as something they apparently found entertaining quickly became something far more sinister. While Jorge was trapped inside the suitcase, Sarah took out her cell phone and began recording. The videos that investigators later recovered from her phone showed Jorge pleading for help. He could be heard calling out from inside the luggage, asking Sarah to let him out. But instead of unzipping the case, Sarah taunted him. In one video, she could be heard saying, "That's what you do when you choke me." In another, she told him, "That's what I feel like when you cheat on me." She laughed as he begged. The recordings lasted several minutes, documenting Jorge's increasingly desperate attempts to escape, while Sarah refused to release him. After recording the videos, Sarah went upstairs to bed. She left Jorge zipped inside the suitcase overnight. By the time morning came, Jorge Torres Jr. had suffocated. When Sarah came downstairs and discovered him unresponsive, she called 911. Deputies from the Orange County Sheriff's Office arrived at the apartment and found Jorge's body still inside the blue suitcase. The scene was immediately treated as suspicious. When detectives interviewed Sarah later that day at the police department, she told them she didn't remember recording the videos. But when investigators showed her the footage from her own phone, the evidence was impossible to deny. Sarah Boone was arrested on February 24, 2020, and charged with second-degree homicide. She was held in Orange County Jail without bail. What followed was one of the most unusual legal proceedings in Florida history. Over the next 4.5 years, 8 different attorneys withdrew from representing Sarah. 7 of them were court-appointed lawyers who cited irreconcilable differences with their client. Judge Michael Kranick eventually ruled that Sarah had forfeited her right to court-appointed counsel due to her pattern of cycling through lawyers. At one hearing in July of 2024, Sarah appeared in court representing herself.
During this extended
and submitted
period,
a hand-drawn
prosecutors offered Sarah
advertisement
a plea deal.
asking for an attorney
If she
to take
pleaded
her
guilty
case.
to manslaughter,
The advertisement
she would
was
receive a
circulated by
15-year
media
sentence.
outlets covering
Sarah
the proceedings,
rejected the offer.
and eventually
She
an attorney
insisted on
named
going
James
to trial,
Owens
believing
agreed
she
to
could convince
represent
a
her.
jury that she was the victim, not the perpetrator. Her decision to turn down the plea would prove costly. The trial finally began on October 14, 2024, more than 4 years after Jorge's passing. Assistant State Attorney William J. presented the case for the prosecution. He told the jury that Sarah had zipped Jorge into the suitcase with malicious intent to punish him, then went upstairs to sleep and left him to take his final breaths alone. The videos from Sarah's phone were played in court, allowing jurors to hear Jorge's pleas and Sarah's taunting responses. Sarah's defense team argued that she suffered from battered spouse syndrome and had acted out of fear of Jorge. They presented evidence of the abuse Sarah claimed to have endured, including allegations that Jorge had physically harmed her throughout their relationship. When prosecutors asked Sarah why she hadn't unzipped the suitcase, she told them she wanted Jorge to understand how she felt so that maybe he could progress and be a better person. The jury heard all of the testimony, reviewed the evidence, and deliberated for just over 1 hour. On October 25, 2024, they returned a unanimous verdict. Sarah Boone was guilty of second-degree homicide. After the conviction, Sarah's legal team filed a motion for a new trial, citing alleged prosecutorial misconduct and other complaints about how the case was handled. Judge Kranick reviewed the motion and denied it, stating that his review of the record, his participation in the trial, and his examination of all the evidence supported the jury's decision. On December 2, 2024, Sarah appeared in court for sentencing. Jorge's mother, Blanca Torres, delivered a tearful victim impact statement. She told the judge that Sarah had not only taken her son, but had also taken a father, a brother, and an uncle. She said that sometimes when she looks out the window, she still waits for Jorge to come and tell her he loves her. Jorge's daughter, Ava, described her father as one of a kind and a hidden gem, taken by what she called sheer malice. Sarah also spoke before the court. She gave a 20-minute statement in which she detailed the abuse she claimed to have suffered at Jorge's hands. She said that Jorge had harmed her physically and in other ways throughout their relationship. She ended by saying, "I forgive myself for falling in love with a monster,
And no matter how he may have appeared to others, I still loved him, hoped for him, and forgave him. Her attorney, James Owens, asked the judge to show mercy, pointing to expert testimony that Sarah had suffered from intimate partner violence. But Judge Cranick was unmoved. He sentenced Sarah Bone to life in prison in the Florida Department of Corrections. Today, Sarah Bone is incarcerated in Florida, serving a sentence that will keep her behind bars for the rest of her life. Jorge Torres Jr.'s family continues to mourn the loss of a man they describe as loving and full of potential. The case of Sarah Bone forces us to ask difficult questions about relationships marked by mutual harm, about when self-defense becomes revenge, and about the moment a game stops being playful and becomes something far darker. On that February night, Jorge climbed into a suitcase believing it was just another moment in an evening of drinking and games. He had no way of knowing that the woman he lived with would decide, in that moment, to leave him there until morning. And by the time the sun rose, it was already too late.
Leah Cecilia Brewer. How many times does someone have to hurt you before you realize the pattern will never change? When does hope for reconciliation become complicity in your own destruction? In April of 2023, a 44-year-old man in Lacey Lakeview, Texas, made the choice to welcome back an estranged girlfriend who had a documented history of attacking him. He had declined to press charges when she stabbed him in the face with a car key 6 months earlier. He had forgiven her. He had given her another chance. And on April 24th, that decision would cost him everything. His brother-in-law would find him lying on a deflated air mattress, his body bearing more than 50 knife wounds, his apartment walls smeared with blood. This is the story of Leah Cecilia Brewer. Leah Brewer was 38 years old when she stood in a McLennan County courtroom and pleaded guilty to ending the life of David Ralph Peeler. She was from Oklahoma, a woman whose past was marked by instability and violence that seemed to escalate with each passing year. Court records would later reveal that just 5 days before she traveled to Texas to see David, she had attacked another man with a knife in Tulsa, Oklahoma, cutting his arm during an altercation. The pattern was clear. The warning signs were flashing, but David Peeler chose to see the woman he loved rather than the danger she represented. David and Leah had what family members described as an on and off relationship, the kind that cycles through breakups and reconciliations without ever finding stable ground. Friends and relatives knew the relationship was troubled. In October of 2022, Leah had physically assaulted David, punching him and stabbing him in the face with a car key. The attack left visible injuries and police were aware of the incident, but David refused to press charges. He told investigators that despite what had happened, they were still involved in a relationship. He believed things could get better. He believed she would change. In the weeks before his passing, David and Leah had been communicating by text message. The exchanges were tense, filled with arguments and unresolved tension. On April 20th, 2023, Leah sent David a message telling him she was coming to visit that weekend. The texts revealed that they had been fighting, but David agreed to let her come. All communication between them ceased on April 20th, a silence that investigators would later interpret as evidence that Leah had already arrived at his apartment by that date, and something terrible had already begun. Leah traveled from Oklahoma to Lacey Lakeview, bringing her sister, Joanne Array Kometseva, with her. The two women arrived at David's apartment at the Village Square complex on Myers Lane. Evidence found at the scene suggested they had spent time there preparing food and drinking. Detectives noted that there were signs of meal preparation for 3 people, with chairs arranged in front of the television that weren't typically there unless David had visitors. 4 different types of alcoholic beverages were found in the apartment. One was David's preferred drink, another was Leah's. A neighbor later told police that she had heard a disturbance coming from apartment 57 a couple of nights before David's body was discovered. She looked out her door and saw a woman yelling into the apartment at what sounded like 2 male voices arguing inside. The argument, whatever its cause, would escalate into something far worse. On April 24, 2023, David Peeler was attacked in his own home. He was stabbed more than 50 times across his torso, sides, and neck. The assault was so intense that blood was found smeared on the bedroom walls and pooled in large amounts in the bathroom area. David's body was found lying face up on a deflated air mattress, surrounded by the evidence of what investigators would describe as an extraordinarily violent end.
his brother-in-law discovered him shortly after 4 p.m. that day and immediately called police.
After the attack, Leah and her sister attempted to cover their tracks. According to statements Leah later made to investigators and information provided by a jail informant he spoke with Leah while she was in custody, the sisters worked together to dispose of evidence. The murder weapon, which at one point had been lodged in David's neck, was removed from the scene. David's phone was taken. Blood-soaked items were gathered. All of it was thrown into a dumpster near the Kate Ross apartments on South 11th Street. The sisters then called for an Uber, and surveillance footage confirmed that a driver picked up 2 passengers from the area of David's apartment and transported them to the Greyhound bus station in Waco early in the morning on April 23rd. The ride had been paid for using David's account, suggesting the sisters had access to his phone and finances even as he lay deceased in his apartment. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives obtained surveillance footage from a Dollar General store in Oklahoma showing Leah wearing the same jacket and shoes that were later found in David's apartment. They recovered emails and Uber receipts that placed both sisters at the scene. They interviewed the Uber drivers who had transported the women, and both drivers identified Leah from photo lineups. The case against her became overwhelming. Leah was arrested on May 17, 2023. She was initially held out of state for approximately 75 days before being transferred to McLennan County. Due to a technicality in the timing of her indictment, she was briefly released on a personal recognizance bond in October of 2023. But within days, she violated the conditions of her release by failing to report to the address she had been ordered to stay at. She was arrested again and returned to jail, where she would remain until her case was resolved. Leah's sister, Joanne Kametsova, was arrested in California and charged with murder and tampering with physical evidence. Prosecutors initially believed both sisters had conspired to take David's life, but as the investigation continued, the evidence suggested that while Joanne had helped dispose of evidence and had been present during the attack, Leah was the one who had inflicted the fatal wounds. On April 14, 2025, Leah Cecilia Brewer stood before Judge Susan Kelly in the 54th State District Court and pleaded guilty to murder. In exchange for her plea, prosecutors recommended a sentence of 35 years in prison. The judge accepted the recommendation. Leah will be required to serve at least half of her sentence before becoming eligible for parole, which means she will spend a minimum of 17.5 years behind bars. During the sentencing hearing, David's family delivered emotional victim impact statements that captured the depth of their loss. His younger sister spoke directly to Leah, her voice filled with pain and anger. "I wonder how alone, betrayed, and scared he must have felt that day. I wonder how many of the 52 stabs did he feel. There are no words to describe seeing your brother in his casket." She told Leah that she hoped she would suffer for the rest of her life, just as David's family would. David's older sister reminded the court that David had left a treatment program to be with Leah, that he had trusted her, and that she had repaid that trust by taking his life in his own home. Prosecutors praised the work of the Lacey Lakeview Police Department and their own investigative team for building a case that secured a guilty plea and spared David's family the trauma of a trial. Leah's attorney expressed sympathy for the Peeler family and acknowledged that her client had accepted responsibility for what she had done. Joanne Kametsova eventually accepted a plea deal in August of 2025. The murder charge against her was dropped, and she pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and given credit for the 436 days she had already served, making her eligible for parole almost immediately. Today, Leah Cecilia Brewer is serving her sentence in a Texas prison. David Peeler's family continues to grieve the loss of a man they called Uncle Bubba, a brother who brought light into every room, a person who deserved far better than the end he received. The case of Leah Brewer stands as a reminder that forgiveness, while noble, cannot protect you from someone determined to harm you. David gave Leah multiple chances. He declined to press charges when she attacked him. He welcomed her back into his life even after she had shown him exactly who she was. And in the end, his compassion became the very thing that allowed her to destroy him.